Hello, everybody. Michael Silber here, Event Director for Enlit Australia, with another one of our discussions with industry leaders. We're very lucky today to have with us James Tipping, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Electricity Authority of New Zealand. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. As a beginning, can you provide our audience with an overview of the authority's role in the New Zealand electricity industry?
Sure thing. So the Electricity Authority is an independent Crown entity in New Zealand. We were established under the Electricity Act 2010. Over here, we're responsible for overseeing and regulating the electricity market in New Zealand. We regulate the electricity market by developing, administering and enforcing the market rules that govern nearly every aspect of our electricity industry, including generation, transmission, system operation, security of supply, market arrangements, metering, distribution and retail. We also contract service providers to operate the electricity market and system, and we analyse and monitor the performance of the market and of the electricity industry. We place a really strong emphasis on voluntary market facilitation measures, which include the provision of education, guidelines, and electricity market related information.
That's certainly a broad charter. But with that said, could you give us a little bit more insight on how the authority guarantees affordable and reliable electricity for your consumers?
Our role is to promote competition in, reliable supply by, and the efficient operation of New Zealand's electricity industry for the long-term benefit of our consumers. That's our statutory objective as it's set out in the Act. We set the operation of the areas of the electricity industry we regulate into rules, which are referred to as the Electricity Industry Participation Code. So we develop, monitor and enforce compliance with the code. We contract market service providers to operate systems to give effect to the electricity market that delivers lowest cost electricity to customers through competitive offer processes. We provide information to investors in generation around other services to the electricity market. And we develop market facilitation, such as guidelines, which we're talking about today, and training.
So, James, earlier you mentioned that you cover the industry broadly. Could you elaborate a bit more on how you cover everything from generation through transmission, distribution on down to retail?
So we regulate a very wide area of the electricity industry in New Zealand. This includes certain but not all activities of market operation service providers, network owners, including local networks and secondary networks, all electricity retailers, which includes any retailer that sells any electricity to a customer, metering providers, test houses that provide assurance for a metering installation, generators, including customers who install distributed generation, such as solar, ancillary service suppliers, dispatchable demand providers, anyone that deals with electricity hedges, and anyone that buys or sells from or to the electricity market. What we don't regulate, however, are the monopoly network owners, the rates of return on those networks, or energy efficiency or electrical safety.
I see. So that would lead me into my next question, which is very specific to your customer care guidelines. Can you discuss that a little bit more detail?
Sure. The customer care guidelines are a proposed replacement for two existing guidelines that we have. Those are the guidelines for medically dependent consumers and the guidelines for vulnerable consumers. They were designed to create consistency in the way that electricity retailers support medically dependent and vulnerable consumers. The existing guidelines we have were first produced in 2004. Since that time, there have been a number of updates to those guidelines, the most recent being an addendum that came into effect on 30th of June this year. While the existing guidelines serve our customers well, or consumers, there have been significant changes in the electricity industry in New Zealand since they were introduced, and most of the changes will be common to international jurisdictions. So, for example, we've had significant growth in the population in New Zealand, and the number of electricity retailer brands has changed as companies enter and exit the electricity market. At last count, we had around 40 retail brands for a population of around 5 million. Technologies have evolved, with some retailers now only having an online presence. Most residential premises now have a smart meter that's operated remotely to, amongst other things, connect or disconnect a home without undertaking a site visit to check for an at-risk customer. 85% or so of customers have a smart meter now. So a wide range of stakeholders have an interest in the refreshed guidelines, including retailers, customers, consumers, budget, social and support agencies, and health practitioners. And to update or to guide the development of the consumer care guidelines, we held collaborative workshops and undertook targeted stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders have contributed to the design, the structure, and the content of the guidelines, and the proposed consumer care guidelines can be found on our website.
You may have already answered this, but if you could just, if you could sum up what the primary purpose of the guidelines are, that would be great.
So the consumer care guidelines have been designed to apply to all domestic consumers with additional recommendations for medically dependent consumers. The guidelines will support retailers to firstly adopt behaviours and processes that foster positive relationships with domestic consumers. Secondly, help domestic consumers maximise their potential to access and afford a constant electricity supply suitable for their needs. And thirdly, to help domestic consumers minimise harm caused by insufficient access to electricity or by payment difficulties. The guidelines describe key actions, processes and outcomes for electricity retailers to aim for and adopt when interacting with and supporting their customers. The guidelines make recommendations focusing on retailers' overarching systems and records, and they're structured to follow the consumer journey with more prescriptive guidance focusing on the pinch points of what happens when payment difficulties are anticipated or they arise. As the electricity industry can appear complex and large, consumers often do not understand their rights or their options or what can be done to prevent themselves from entering into a situation where payment's difficult. So the guidelines recognise that consumers may move in or out of medical dependency or in or out of experiencing payment difficulties for a variety of reasons, and operating processes are really the key to ensuring consumer safety. So the guidelines draw a distinction between fraud and stressed consumers or customers that may be unwilling or unable to engage. The guidelines intend to strike a balance, though, recognising that retailers have a right to be paid for their services and ensuring that customers and consumers have a fair opportunity to seek assistance before the retailers commence action for non-payment.
Okay, so to drill down a bit more into this, do you have any additional specifics on how the authority aids consumers in their dealings with power companies in particular?
As an independent Crown entity, we provide regulatory oversight of the electricity sector, as explained before. Our work's focused on addressing key questions that affect the long-term benefits of consumers. So among those questions, we consider, are prices reasonable? Will the lights stay on? Do consumers have choices? And is innovation occurring? The proposed consumer care guidelines are really comprehensive and attuned to the New Zealand industry. The guidelines set out recommendations for retailers which cover, but are not limited to, the following things. So firstly, the creation of a public-facing consumer care policy, which sets out how a retailer will interact with their customers. We want to bring real clarity and transparency for all customers and advocates who may interact with that retailer. Secondly, how a retailer should communicate with their consumers, how to manage disconnections, and how to manage consumers who are medically dependent on electricity. We've worked really closely with industry to produce these proposed consumer care guidelines. We know that, like us, retailers really want to protect New Zealand's consumers. And as an overarching thing, we recently reset our organisational strategy at the authority, and we set out 5 sector ambitions to guide and prioritise our work around. One of those ambitions is for consumer centricity to drive our regulatory work and participants' behaviour. The work that we've done here on the consumer care guidelines, together with our stakeholders, is an example of the electricity industry actively demonstrating and living out those ambitions, keeping consumers and consumer outcomes right at the centre of their decision making.
James, this is really good stuff, and we feel quite fortunate to be able to bring a New Zealand perspective to our audience. It's much appreciated that you gave us this time. And hopefully we'll see you next year at our live event in Melbourne. But once again, thank you, and we will talk to you soon.
You're welcome. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Our pleasure.